Good evening, everybody. It is wonderful to see everyone. This is Mike DiCandido. I am the co-founder and board chair of Common Bonds, and welcome to our Zoe Rogers Speaker Series event tonight. We have a wonderful group of panelists and a great moderator to talk about what I think we all agree are is a very important topic in our society around law enforcement and policing. A couple of things that I want to just bring up before I introduce the speakers, the panelists, and our moderator. First, again, want to welcome all of you. We have a number of existing Common Bonds followers, and we have some new followers as well. So welcome. We ask you during the presentation if you can keep your audio and video off, so that we can minimize the amount of distractions that we have. So that would be appreciated. And we do take questions. And to ask a question, if you go to the chat feature, I think many of us are used to using Zoom, but on the bottom of your screen in the middle, you'll see a chat feature. And if you hit on that, you'll see a chat function that's going on, and you can see some of the feedback already on there. And certainly use the chat to ask questions, as well as if you have some insights of the dialogue that is going on that you want to add, or some publications that reinforce some of the messages, etc. That would be great. So welcome, and we'll move forward with that. So again, I'm thrilled for the topic we have tonight, and I'm thrilled to introduce our panelist for this evening. The first person I'd like to introduce is Major Benjamin Brooks. Major Ben, as he's known to all of us, is a retired major of the Pennsylvania State Police, a management consultant, and a founder of Major Ben's consulting agency, specializing in providing assistance to companies to more effectively implement their cultural diversity programs. Major Ben is a native of Elizabethtown, North Carolina. He's received a Bachelor's of Arts degree in sociology from Kutztown University. He completed the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania's management training program for senior managers, the FBI National Academy, Pennsylvania State University Police Supervisor in-service training, and Pennsylvania's Executive Development Program. And he's also certified by the U.S. Department of Justice for diversity training. Major Ben yearning for social justice led him to enlist in the Pennsylvania State Police. In 1961, he was one of the first African Americans in the history of the state police. Ben rose through the ranks to become the first African American captain troop commander of the state police. In 1987, Brooks became the first enlisted member of the Pennsylvania State Police to head the Affirmative Action Contract Compliance Division. In that capacity, he developed the state police sexual harassment policies, training programs, and redefined the concept of affirmative action. He's an international speaker and a member of the National Speakers Association, American Seminar Leaders Association, Dale Carnegie Group, and many other organizations. And what I should have said before is I'm only reading a portion of their wonderful backgrounds. You can find their detailed bios on our Common Bonds website. So Major Ben, welcome, and great pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you.
Our next esteemed panelist is Susan Slawson. Susan is a retired lieutenant of the Philadelphia Police Department, a management consultant, and an executive coach. As a 30-year veteran and a civil service employee of the city of Philadelphia, she's keenly aware of diversity and inclusion issues, particularly around law enforcement. Lieutenant Slawson earned a bachelor's degree in management from Geneva University, also received a certificate as an executive coach from Concordia University in Irvine, California. She also had a yearning for social justice at a young age and led her to join the Philadelphia Police Department, where she rose through the ranks to attain the position of lieutenant. Her first assignment was the first district of South Philadelphia, and her professionalism and community involvement positioned her to be selected as a representative for the department in the Public Affairs Division. Because of her yearning for comprehensive futuristic view of law enforcement and community engagement, she accepted an assignment as the commanding officer of the Police Athletic League. In that capacity, she commanded over 50 employees, and she led the opening of 3 new PAL facilities, which created more athletic, recreational, educational, and cultural opportunities for youth in the inner city, particularly girls. Based on her wonderful performance there and her background, she was appointed the Recreation Commissioner for the City of Philadelphia in 2018 by Mayor Michael Nutter. And in that role, she oversaw a $7 million capital renovation of the Dell Music Center, which hosts concerts during the summer months. Many organizations have recognized her achievements, including the Police Athletic League, the Philadelphia Tribune, the Philadelphia Business Journal, the National Congress of Black Women, and many others. Lieutenant Slawson, it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Our third panelist is John Gooley. John is the Chief Security Officer at Cardinal Point Homeland Security. He's also a 28-year veteran of the Lower Merion Police Department in Montgomery County. During his police career, John was the supervisor, patrol, and commander of special investigations. John is a certified protection professional through the American Society for Industrial Security. He has a CPP certification on international that is internationally recognized, globally accredited program. And he's a recognized Safety Act designate and has a recognized Safety Act designation from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Cardinal Point is doing some wonderful work with the state of Pennsylvania to perform a variety of different diversity, equity, and inclusion training, particularly for municipal employees, including law enforcement. And John is leading that for that organization. John holds a master's degree in criminal justice leadership from St. Joseph's University here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So John, welcome. It's a pleasure to see you again, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Finally, I'm thrilled and backed by popular demand, we shall say, to have Mark Hayes back to moderate this session. Some of you who joined our very, very popular session on critical race theory saw Mark moderate that conversation. And Mark is has 3 decades of bringing news viewers in major cities across the country their news and information of the day. He had stops in Dallas, Denver, Detroit, and Baltimore. For more than a decade, he was the staple of early morning television on Good Day Atlanta. After 2 Emmy nominations and highly coveted national recognition for spot news coverage from the National Press Association, he is currently the president and CEO of his own media training and strategy company, Mark Hayes Consulting. His goal is to help everyone from CEOs to small business owners make the most of their opportunities for media exposure. He's a passionate supporter of the Boys and Girls Club in every city he's been part of. He's a supporter of drug abuse, recovery, and prevention efforts with different organizations. And again, a number of other great recognitions and organizations that Mark is part of. So Mark, it's a pleasure to have you here moderating this conversation. And it's always wonderful to have somebody so skilled and experienced to do so. So with that, thanks for your patience as I went through our everybody, and I want to hand it over to Mark, and he'll start the dialogue.
All right, Mike, thanks so much. What a pleasure to be here with you all this evening for such an important topic. This topic about the African-American community and trust with law enforcement is an ongoing conversation. And hopefully tonight we can kind of bridge the gap a little bit, if you will, and get a better understanding of what both sides need to feel more comfortable in the law enforcement profession, of course, and in our neighborhoods that law enforcement patrol. So with that, let's start. Let's go ladies first. Ms. Slawson, the retired lieutenant from the Philadelphia Police Department. Let's talk a little bit about the history and some of these challenges that law enforcement faces in dealing with the African-American community. Can we point our finger on where the issues began?
I think I want to go back real quick, just thinking about one of the things that I share when I teach the class for Cardinal Point. I talk about the history of the Philadelphia Police Department, about policing. And in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson came up with a team of people, and he formed a commission, and they came up with a whole host of ideas, which is where our 911 call comes from. But it was during a time where there was major civil unrest. And prior to that, in the 50s, you didn't have police officers in schools. What was going on in the 50s? You had African-American kids that were allowed, after some push or a little push or major push, depending on how you look at it, to go into schools and start integrating within the schools. That's when police started coming into our school systems. And of course, now they're there for a whole host of reasons. But as a result of the crime in the 60s, the unrest in the 60s, and if we think about the 60s, if we think about Mr. Floyd, it was the same type of unrest. It was the same type of uneasiness. It was the same type of behavior that we saw in the 60s. And what helped us were the cameras. And so there's a systematic issue that we have in policing that has been there from the beginning. And so we're not dealing with something that just started in 2020. We're dealing with something that's been a part of our police system since it's begun. The question for me is, so what do we do now? We know a lot of the issues. We know some of the challenges. We know where they stem from. It stems from African Americans being, for whatever reason, racism is real. We have to acknowledge that. We have to deal with that. And so we can trace it back to the 50s. And here we are, 2022, still dealing with some of the same issues because it's a system issue, not an individual issue.
Yeah. John, let's go to you. Let's talk a little bit about the system, if you will. With the system comes training. Has training kept pace when it comes to bridging this gap that we're talking about between law enforcement and the African-American community? Have we done enough to help our officers and law enforcement professionals forge relationships that, number one, make them safer in their duties, and number two, make them a lot more comfortable and a lot safer as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. Thank you for asking it. And I think that really is the key. We're in law enforcement today. I think we do need to bridge the gap. There's a tremendous gap between young people and police. And I think we definitely need to take some steps to bridge that gap. So one of the ways we do it is I'm very proud to work with both Susan and Major Ben in being a provider for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in a training for school-based law enforcement. So we train, SROs, school police officers, and even security officers. There's an act in Pennsylvania called Act 67 that mandates training for anybody who's working in school-based law enforcement. And I think, with all that's going on in the state legislature, we often think, why did they take the time to mandate a law requiring, and it's a good bit of training, we have to train for 40 hours. Why do we need to do that? And I think it's very important. And I think it does go to bridging that gap. For example, one of the key parts of the course is really to me, it's a game changer for law enforcement, and it's called the trauma-informed approach. And it's a mandate that we have to teach to our law enforcement officers, and it's now mandatory for all law enforcement officers in Pennsylvania. And it stresses the fact that so many children are experiencing those high rates of violence and trauma, and it's having significant impacts, not just on their immediate lives, but for the rest of their lives. And I think that that's really important for police officers to know. I know for me, it was a game changer, learning about that trauma-informed approach and the impact that trauma has on kids. I think we can start to bridge that gap by understanding that trauma, and it really is about race. I mean, a significant number of the individuals impacted by trauma, racism is a form of trauma that impacts children and adolescents for the rest of their lives. It has a significant impact on them. So I think understanding, race and bias, it's very important, and it's a starting point for trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, Major Ben, we have a question from April, and it makes total sense. She says, according to Khalil Gibran Muhammad, a professor of history, race, and public policy at Harvard, policing in America started in the mid-1600s with the Boston Watch, essentially a neighborhood watch group. But in some of the first police forces in the South were, as we know, created to control enslaved Black people, they would become known as slave patrols. And these patrols were established to police the racial norms of white supremacy. This is what we know historically, and it's bled into our modern day policing. Question is, how do we get it out, Major Ben?
Well, I think you basically, to understand, the origin of this, as we talk about the slave patrols, and I did some work on that, and begin to realize that at that time we talk about protect and serve, and what these people were doing. They were slave patrol. There was no education. They were just the baddest guys in the community, and their job was to get runaway slaves and bring them back. And what was that? They were protecting the bourgeoisie from the proletariat. If you look at in Boston, for example, with some of the first utterances of police, that they were hired there to be able to protect the property, and they were tools of the politicians. Again. These were guys that had no education. They were guys who were drunkards. There were all kinds of folks with no real background, and they decided to bring folks in. And when they wanted to formalize it, they wanted to bring some folks in, but people didn't want to do that. So you had volunteers. Going way back then, what we found with the law enforcement, we were always a part from the community and not a part of the community. In the 1950s, and 60s, we began to look at such issues as the community-oriented policing, where we started to look at a more formalized workforce, where we had folks who had some education. And remember, we started to do some educational things back in the early 60s, because we recognized the fact that you had to have some professional standards for folks in there, and they began to look at the educational perspective, and that became very important. There was a big role for law enforcement back then, as Susan was indicating back there. As we talk about the notion of school police in the schools, for example, when we first got our real look at the law enforcement entity there, the 1954 Supreme Court decision on Brown versus Board of Education is that you found that your law enforcement played a prominent role there, because they were very instrumental in the integration of these schools, because they were put on the spot, and began to evolve. And we would realize now over the years, we realized that we could not continue the path that we were going. And so education was a critical piece. So now we have a strong emphasis on now, how do we bring the police and the community together? We know that the law enforcement cannot do without the community, and the community cannot do without the police. And so our big emphasis now is, how do we begin to humanize law enforcement, humanize the community, and understand that we have a shared interest, for working in the community. Like, for example, folks will say, in law enforcement, we have the mistaken belief that we solve crimes. That's not true. What we report crime, but crimes are solved because we have people in the community who are willing to cooperate with us to give us the information. And so there is a strong emphasis now on how do we bridge that gap? How do we start the conversation right now? And it's been a very interesting time, very trying time right now. And so right now we're trying to focus on education and that whole community piece. And so that's a lot of what we have to deal with right now.
Yeah. Susan Slawson, you talked to us or to me a little bit earlier in the week about getting them while they were young, and being a part of the community with the PAL program and the inroads you were able to make with our young people in the community. I know that a part of this conversation has to include changing the image of the police officer and changing the way law enforcement approaches the community it serves. Do we need, because the PAL programs always seem to get cut out of the budget. There's never enough money or resources for programs like that we know work and that we know help us bridge this divide. So is that where we should really begin is with our young people and bringing our law enforcement closer. And that helps, as Major Ben said, to humanize these young folks. If you know a kid that you've watched them grow up over the years, you're more likely to give them a break if you've got to deal with them in a professional capacity.
And coupled with that, if that young person grew up in a PAL center or in an environment where they have relationships with police officers starting at 4, 5, 6 years old, you can start coming to a police athletic league when you're 5, 6 years old. And if that kid is in police presence and it's not confrontational, they're not coming to the home, and the only time they see police is when there is a domestic issue in their home, or there's a shooting on their streets, or there's a fight in their school. If they're growing up and that officer is a friend, because this is where I go every day after school, this is my recreation. This officer has taught me how to play basketball, baseball, when my mom or dad wasn't there. This is who I look to. And if we can get our young people involved at an early age, 5, 6 years old, because we're competing against television telling us that police officers are the worst. We're competing with, unfortunately, music, which tells our young people that police officers are the worst. So they have to have real tangible experiences with law enforcement officers where there's no arrest, there's nothing criminal happening, that they're just a part of their lives. And the Police Athletic League is one of those opportunities within the police department that makes us human. We are part of the community, you know, and if the only time the kid sees us is when something bad is going on, by the time that young person is 13, 14, 15 years old, and the only experience and the only presence that they've had with a police officer has been on the criminal side in their community, there's no relationship. And then that also tends to lead to the issue of, now we're trying to get African-American young men and women on the police force. And because of their tainted view of police officers, because they didn't have that opportunity when they were young to say, oh, I understand that this person is my friend. This is a job that I could potentially have when I get older. But if I'm 14 years old and everything about policing has been negative, everything I've heard, everything I've seen, what's going on in my community, I now don't want that job. We're dealing with this issue of diversity within the police department. We have to start when they're young and pour into them as police officers, as law enforcement officers, to say, we are your friends, we are a part of the community, and we need you to look at us because we need you to be a part of this profession when you get older.
Absolutely. John, I shared with you last week that I have a son that's currently incarcerated, and we're dealing up close and personal with the prison industrial complex and law enforcement. My wife is a former prosecutor, so it's extremely difficult for us. And when we look at the system overall, though, the system of law enforcement, as Ms. Slawson alluded to earlier, and the systematic approach, the prison industrial complex is tightly woven into our economic model, which is also a part of what drives our policing. So I guess that's a tough way to say, I'll put you on the spot, but how do we take the economic incentive out of our approach to law enforcement? I mean, we've got 2.3 million people behind bars in this country. Nobody in the industrialized world does it better than the US. How do we change our mindset when it comes to locking people up and for-profit incarceration?
Yeah, you're exactly right. I believe there is an inherent structural bias, within, that system itself, and it does need to change. And I know it all goes back to what Susan was saying. When we get young people, we have to change the structure in which we're operating. I know, we work a lot with schools, and I'll use the school example as a starting point. Our public schools here in Pennsylvania, they're about half of the funding for public schools is based on the tax revenue. So we know that, some communities are well-funded. They have well-funded tax bases and their schools are well-funded. So in essence, the school and the success of the students, in that school is tied to the wealth of that community. Do we have to fund the schools through half of the tax, half of the funding comes from that? We don't have to do it that way, but I do believe it's a structural bias that exists with the way we have society. It's something we need to change.
Yeah.
And we don't want to create that pipeline to prison. And I think that starts in schools. I mean, quite frankly, we all know that education is one of the predictors of success. Students who do well in school and get a good education, they are more likely than those that don't to succeed. So the goal is to really start in the schools, and we need to get kids to graduate and become good, productive citizens. And I think, we do need to change some of the way, we're structured, because we're in essence supporting that, that prison industrial complex that you referenced.
Right.
Just in the way we educate our kids, they're not receiving the educations, and minority children are more likely to go to prison because of the structure of the way we do things. We need to make some changes, and that's pretty clear to me. But again, it's a good starting point is to look at the way we educate our kids, and I think we need to look at, like Susan said, taking those early opportunities to get them into programs like PAL, where they're connecting with police. And we know that, kids that have those role models and mentors in their lives, they're much more likely to succeed, to overcome some of the traumas that children that don't have those role models and mentors in their lives. So yeah,
Absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right. We do feed that prison complex, and it starts, in our schools.
Major Ben, you've been a part of the training apparatus for a long time. You understand intricately how law enforcement officers are trained and what kind of training they need to be successful and to be safe to get home to their families each and every night. But at the same time, are there currently any form of character assessments that police officers go through? We know that bias and racist attitudes are why we have so many officers that may be considered racist. Is it a deal breaker if we study bias? I mean, how do we weed them out before hiring? And is it even possible to weed out the officers that might exhibit a problem in terms of their racial attitudes on the force and dealing with the communities they serve? That question came to us from Michael here at Common Bonds.
Well, I think one of the things that happens at many law enforcement agencies, they do some psychological evaluations, but sometimes I don't think it's enough. When you think about the power that we invest in law enforcement people, we are the only group that really has the authority legally to take a life. And yet we're woefully prepared to do that, which means then that person has to be as highly trained as you possibly can be. We put them on the street, and we have all kind of physical equipment, and we say that's going to keep us safe. But one of the biggest things I think that keep people safe is to really understand how do we connect with the people we're trying to impact or influence, and that has a lot to do with our verbal skills and dealing with folks out there. Three things that are very important in this whole business of law enforcement that we call leadership, accountability, and training. When you see the kind of aberrant behavior that we see in many vignettes or throughout the year, almost every day, where there's some antisocial behavior going on with the law enforcement entity, and you ask yourself then, why is this happening? If leaders are able to see this, then it seems to me that they should be astute enough to ensure that this kind of thing is not going to happen with their people, but somewhere along the line, it falls through the cracks. So training becomes a critical piece there. And training, and by the way, in anything we do is like sweeping stairs. It has to start at the top and come down. If it doesn't start at the top and come down, it's an exercise in futility. One of the things that I find as we start talking about training, and particularly now we're talking about diversity and inclusion. Many people feel that because we talk about diversity, because we have blacks and whites and males and females, and that dissatisfies our business. No, inclusion is a critical piece of that, and that means that people have an opportunity to be an integral part of the conversation. If I am an African American officer in the organization, I need to have a voice of what impacts the African American community. If you look at people out there who are different than who we are, then we have to have people who are able to make that to bridge that gap, to make that connection. So that's going to be very, very important. As we talk now about law enforcement in the community, there's a big emphasis right now on bias training. They talk about, we want to have a bias-free police department. Well, that's not possible, because bias is how we live. It's not good or bad, but it just is. And the key for us is to look at bias for what it really is, because the decisions that we make are based on our particular bias, whether it's good or bad, and that's one of the things. And as we talk about this business, then, is to, when someone, they rail against the term bias because they get very defensive. And I say that there's no reason to get defensive. We need to be able to explain what bias really is. It's a preference for or against someone or something. And there's two aspects of this. There's bias of fear, trepidation, or dehumanization, and there's bias of comfort, acceptance, and humanization. Now, for example, when Walter Scott was gunned down in South Carolina by this white police officer for a minor traffic violation, and he stopped the guy, and Walter Scott ran for whatever reason, and the officer got out and he fired the shot him down as he's running away. And he said that I did it because I had a fear for my life, so whoa, wait a minute, he's running away from you, so what's the kind of bias is that? Bias of fear, trepidation, and dehumanization, because he shot this man down like a wounded animal. Contrast that then with the Dylan Roof, a young white male who went to Emmanuel Church in South Carolina, and he went into a church and they welcomed him with open arms, and he worshiped with these folks for about an hour before he took 9 lives and escaped. They said an all points bulletin and said, young white male armed and dangerous. He was subsequently apprehended without incident, taken to a Burger King for a meal, and they finally dealt with him there. Now, bias of acceptance, comfort, and humanization. So what are we talking about then? When we are able to humanize people, the African Americans, the people who were shot by the police, or humanize the law enforcement people, because to understand when they have that fear, we need to examine where that fear comes from. Because part of being equipped to hit that street, you really have to understand the dynamics of what happens when you have an interaction with someone, particularly someone who is different. And so right now, so what we have to be able to look at now is to look at our leadership, look at our training, and look at our accountability. Whenever you see aberrant behavior on any YouTube video, you can trace that to a position of leadership, training, and accountability.
Yeah. And I just want to piggyback with Susan Slawson on that point. Susan, we talked about these attitudes coming from the top. And so how do we get the brass on board? Because oftentimes, the feeling in the African-American community is, well, we don't see the people who make the decisions. They rarely come down here, talk to us, unless, some powder keg of an incident has taken place. So how do we get the leaders of the different law enforcement organizations on board, and when it comes to rooting out? Because it's a small percentage of the officers that are getting all the attention for these aberrant acts.
I believe that you have to want to see it. Okay, you have to want to see it. If you're a supervisor, you're on the streets, and the officer that murdered George Floyd, he had a list of prior incidents before this incident. So if you're a supervisor, you don't even have to be way in the top. If you're a supervisor and, okay, I commit an incident, I break the law because that's what this guy did.
Today, but I
Okay.
want to give you 10% off today.
No, 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 no.
No,
You
it's
don't.
fine.
No.
Just
Oh.
So, so I break the law, right? And my supervisor, he just kind of blows it off. Oh, it's like that. So I do it again, and I do it again. So that's the supervisory portion of that, right? As a police officer, I need to decide whether I'm going to work and have integrity, not just with my community, but with the police that I'm working with as well. That thin blue line, you have to decide whether or not you're coming on the police department and you're going to stand for something that is honorable for the citizens of Philadelphia and yourself. But the brass also needs to ensure that they're watching, looking at paperwork, making sure training is happening. I'm actually on the, when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about racism, we're talking about trying to figure out where do we start, where do we go, what are some of the issues. I'm on the board of the Philadelphia Police Foundation, and their job is to provide support and resources to the Philadelphia Police Department, where the city's budget ends, they pick up, and you have a whole host of individuals, business leaders, philanthropists that are committing money to ensure that resources that the police department doesn't have, they have. One of the things that we're doing on the Philadelphia Police Foundation board is that the current test is called the Nelson Denny reading test. And it's culturally biased. It does not really determine whether or not you're a good reader. It is on a college level. And so if you're going to a public school, as opposed to one of the prep schools, we have an issue because they've learned the necessary information, right, to take the test. That young person that's graduating from one of the public schools here in Philadelphia, we're talking about systemic issues. This test has been around since the mid-1990s. And that's the test that the Philadelphia police have been taking. So it's important. Now we're talking about the brass. Commissioner Outlaw has she's noticed it, she's brought it up, and she has actually pushed us to start. Can we do something about this test? Can we make this test fair? Can we make this test comparable for not just those people that are in a prep school, but for some of the people that are African American, that might even be white, that might be Latino, but haven't had the opportunity to go to one of the prep schools. And so when we're talking about systemic issues, here's a big one. We have a test that's not fair. And so most of the minorities that are taking this test are going to fail. And so when you're talking about brass, you have a police commissioner right now who's saying, I've identified a problem. And that's what you need with the brass. Identify the problem and let's go to the people. The city of Philadelphia doesn't have the funding. So the Police Foundation, they came up with money and we're doing the research. We're hiring professors. We actually have to go to the state to figure out how do we change this test. This is how we deal with some of the racial issues that have been within the police department for years, and that has caused minorities not to even be able to, well, yeah, they participate, but that's where it stops.
Mr. Gooley, tell me a little bit more about the roadblocks or hurdles, if you will, to recruiting good police officers. I mean, where do law enforcement brass recruit from? Is it the colleges? Is it technical colleges, junior colleges? Can you give us an idea about the sense of where your recruiting pool lies?
Yeah, I think the key is we definitely need to recruit representative police officers of the community. And I think we need to be able to have as Susan mentioned, we need to have qualified applicants. So yeah, I think we definitely need to look at the college environment. for recruiting for police. The days of recruiting from the military, I think, we need officers that can think today. We don't need officers that bring with them a militaristic mindset. So I think in the testing and the recruitment, we definitely need to look at bringing in a higher caliber officer, educated officers, and people that are able to think and deal with the problems that we're confronted with on a daily basis.
Hey, John, we had a question come in to that vein. And speaking of military service, Marcus is a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps, and he said that they had rules of engagement. And his question is, how do we establish some equivalent for law enforcement officers so that situations don't escalate to the level we've seen happening far too often?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it goes to emphasize that point. In the military, the rules of engagement are really different than the rules of engagement in policing. And one of those critical policies that we really need to look at in policing is just that. It's the use of force. So I think that's a very important policy implication in the police realm. When does an officer use force? And certainly the horrific act that occurred with George Floyd brought that to the limelight. We really need to look at our officers and the force that they're using, things like chokeholds, and even the responsibility of other officers to intervene should they see excessive force being used. Susan talked about that thin blue line and how you don't cross that line when another officer is using force. Well, yeah, you do. We have the responsibility to make sure that the profession, and it really is a profession, I think all of us would agree, Ben and Susan, that we want to see law enforcement treated as a true profession. And to do that, we really need to elevate that profession in terms of standards and how we treat, both the arrestees and each other.
Yeah. Following up on that point, Major Ben, we have another question on qualified immunity. And the question simply states, is it going to solve anything? Will qualified immunity actually solve anything, or do we just not understand how it works?
Well, I think we first of all need to understand how it works. Law enforcement, enjoy a great benefit because of the kind of things we do. And when we talk about qualified immunity, we want to be able to give them as much leeway as we possibly can. But in light of all that, there still has to be the position of transparency. And transparency comes about because when you have a comprehensive educational awareness, we can't use qualified immunity as a scapegoat to excuse some behaviors. If you have qualified immunity, you still have to have accountability, because when you think about this, 99% of the officers out there do a great job, but the 1% is killing us. And the 1% is allowed to be there because the 99% sometimes become complicit in their existence. So when we start to hold their feet to the fire, whether it's qualified immunity or not, hold their feet to the fire, then it begins to change. Because think about it this way. For the longest time, we control the narrative, and we call the terms. And so now there's oversight from the community right now, and we rail against that, So qualified immunity is kind of a buffer for that. So I say we can have that, but we still are going to have transparency and accountability.
Yeah. Yeah. Ms. Slawson, going back to your days in the Philadelphia Police Department and understanding what you're dealing with now, for over the past 3 decades, we've seen the kinds of interactions become, more volatile. Well, let me say this: we see it on camera more. African American folks will tell you this has been going on for some time. But right now, the video is just a whole lot better. The quality of the video is a whole lot better. So what should folks in the African American community know about what law enforcement is doing to try to come together, to try to get us, speaking the same language, if you will, when it comes to protecting the community and when it comes to making things easier for both sides. I mean, Philadelphia last year with a record number of homicides. Most of those homicides occurred by gun violence. Getting guns off the street, I would imagine, includes a whole lot of tips from people in the community so you can figure out exactly who's got them. But in order to do that, it all starts with relationships.
I think Major Ben said earlier that police don't solve crimes. If we don't have relationships with community members, if we are not trusted, and the challenge that we're having right now within the African-American community, within minority communities, because it's not just African-American, it is also Latino communities as well. The challenge that we're having is that we're not trusted anymore. So the first thing we have to do, we have to get back on the streets and build the trust. That means walking beats. That means listening to people, getting them to a place in life again where they're even willing to have a conversation, where they're willing. Let's start with just saying hello, because we don't have that anymore. And so I'm not going to help you solve a crime when, as far as I'm concerned, we can't continue to be viewed as the enemy. So police officers, police commanders, the law enforcement community, it really isn't up to the community at this point to fix this. We have to go in these communities and work with them and ask, how can we begin to bridge the gap again? How can we, or what can we do to build your trust again? Because they've seen too many times that police officers have just committed crimes, and whether it's on their sons, on their daughters, it has to be dealt with by us going and having conversations. You know, that 1967 act that John was talking about, that's where this whole training and money for training came into play under Lyndon Johnson. And so we need to start working with the community. Can we offer you some training to let you understand what we do, how we do it? Let's make them a part of what we do, but it's up to the law enforcement entities to go to the community and say, we're here, we need to figure out what we can do to help you bridge the gap so you can trust us again.
Absolutely. And Sheriff Gooley, getting over to you, when we started hearing the defund the police cries, I think most of us realized that defund the police wasn't the best catchphrase. And it was more like, can we refine the way we do policing in the modern day, in the 21st century? But defund the police and those kinds of politicized slogans seem to make things worse. Tell me a little bit about law enforcement's reaction and what that message said to the law enforcement community about what needs to be done in order to get back into the communities and begin to kind of mend the fences, if you will.
I think the point that the police are always going to be operating in the community. We need to be partners in that community. And, you know, the idea of defunding the police, especially in areas where we're seeing high incidents of violence, it's not going to solve anything. Taking more officers off the street, we need to use your term, we need to refine the funding for the police. How are we spending the money in police budgets? We don't need to buy tanks and high-tech SWAT gear. I think we really need to look at, you know, training our officers and giving them, you know, the tools to work within their communities. That's the emphasis for funding. So I think the funding needs to be refined on the way we're spending our money within police departments. We need to spend the money more effectively. And we need to give the police the appropriate training to deal with the issues that they're confronted with today. And there's a lot of issues. The police are often put in situations that their hands are often tied. And we have when we do some trainings in schools, I'll give you an example. we have a little scenario where a resident calls the police, and we have the students participate in this, and we tell the students, the resident calls and they said there's a black male sitting in a car in front of my house. They've been there for about a half an hour, and you now take that call. So we have, black students, white students take the role of that police officer. What do you do when you get that call? That this person, are there really grounds to go and stop that person and bother them? So I think it's an example of how we really need to work within the community. When community members call the police, we need to have a reason. Why, what is a suspicious person? What constitutes making that call to the police? What is the person doing that constitutes, give the police some tools to work within their communities, give them a reason to make that stop, and not just, have these slogans, call the police if you see something suspicious. We have to really train the community a little bit better as well to work hand in hand so that we're working as partners and not creating an adversarial relationship with, people that may just be parked on a street.
Absolutely. And Major Ben, I wanted you to talk a little bit about bringing all the stakeholders together. We also had an interesting question about not seeing, this is from John Ridgway. He asks, why don't we see educational paid announcements or branding campaigns educating the community on the positive side of effective policing? So basically, why aren't police departments doing more PR, if you will, to let folks know exactly what they're doing and how they're trying to get better and the efforts they're making? And then I wanted you to talk a little bit about bringing all the stakeholders together too, and sort of meeting in the middle, meeting of the minds, if you will.
Okay. That has always been part of my MO in dealing with this. We say in our business, the community makes news, and the police make news and the newspaper report it. Police officers do so many wonderful things on a daily basis, but no one knows about it. The idea of where we are, right, we have one of the greatest products going, but we don't advertise it. And I think to be able to do public service announcements and all kinds of positive things are important for us. I have a class called Policing Your Image, and people will say, well, the police always put in a bad light and they keep writing bad stuff about us. I said, well, the reason they write bad stuff about it because you don't give them the positive stuff. And they said, well, we give them some information, but they don't write it. No. If you give them some information, you got to keep giving them information because we know that bad news travels very, very fast. And so if we have something going, let the public know. For example, coming in as the first African-American as a captain, I was also a troop commander. I recognized that I was not going to be the person who was going to make a lot of changes, but I had to have community folks with me. Everything that we did, then we brought in the news media, and we had publicity. If we did a program on a pattern after 1 minute matters, catching somebody doing something right, and we started stopping motorists and just sharing with them some positive things that we've seen about them, and so. We had some people that we wrote some nice letters and things about them. And when we got that together, we brought these folks in, had a little news conference and had a big blast and let the people know things we're doing with the community. And so that worked very well. So how do we make this stuff happen? Some years ago, I was in Ramapo, New York, and we did a program and worked with NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And we talked about the police in the community and the division that we had. So I decided at that time then, it was a great opportunity because we had the school board presidents there, we had the superintendents of schools, we have the district attorney's office, public defenders, police officers, unions, and NAACP, all kinds of people. So what we did then was we got groups together. We put the police on one side of the room and the community on the other side of the room, gave each of an easel with newsprint. And I said, I want you to write down all of the issues with the police, all the issues you have with the community, and the community, all the issues you have with the police. And then we put that together. We brought it in front of the class and we looked at it and said, okay, now let's flip. So I said the community to the police chart and the police to the community chart. Now, I want you to look at all of the issues that we have there. And I want you to examine every one of them and come up with some constructive, comprehensive answers to look at these issues. And they did. Well, at the end of the day, the police guy said, you know, we never knew how much support we had from the community. And the community says, we never knew the issues that law enforcement had. And they came together, they were shaking hands and exchanging numbers. So what I looked at that and say, well, how do we package this? When we can bring all of the stakeholders together at the table, and when you do this, there cannot be blame or guilt in any of the conversations. And look at how we begin to humanize both sides and say, look at that. We have a situation here where there is an interdependency relationship that has to be. The police cannot operate without the community, and the community cannot operate without the police. And so we look at a shared interest, and then only then are we going to be able to bring this whole thing together. Because if I can look you in the eye, have a conversation with you, be able to shake your hand, I will humanize you more than you can possibly imagine. But if we do everything apart from, we have more of the same. So coming together as a cooperative is the only way to make that happen.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And wow, time has flown by. These three folks are absolutely amazing. And I want to thank Major Ben Brooks, Lieutenant Susan Slawson, and Sheriff John Gooley for allowing me some time to get to know you three. I really enjoyed chatting with you tonight and in our previous phone calls. And Michael and April, thank you so much for letting me participate once again. And for you folks out there watching, thanks for being here. And we're going to post the video in about a week or so. And then we had some more great questions in the chat. And so we may have to do a follow-up session if Mike and April think it's warranted, but we could talk about this subject all night. But thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, and to our three panelists for an amazing conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you so much, Mark, for moderating this session. Thank you, Major Ben, Susan, and John Gooley. Thank you so much for your openness and your willingness to come share with our community this very, very sensitive subject. You know, this is really the reason why we're here. This subject is the reason why Common Bonds was formed, because it was because of the policing activity around the murder of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and of course the community watch persons, or three people who killed Ahmaud Arbery. So this really is very real for me personally and for our community, and is the reason why we're here. So I am so very glad that we have had the opportunity to talk about it, because really that is where we start. We start when we communicate honestly and openly. It's still really raw for me. Honestly, this subject is one of those subjects where it's challenging, because, you know, it's one of those things where I can't really hear what you say because I see what you do. For me, it's personal. You know, Mike, the co-founder of Common Bonds, when George Floyd was murdered, called to check on me because it's so personal, because I have two sons and I have a daughter, and every time something tragic happens with regard to policing and African-American murder, it's close to me. So, but I thank you for being willing to come to us and start the dialogue. It's so needed. This is where it starts. It starts with us reasoning together, with us talking about it together. So We definitely appreciate you and thank you again for helping us to see both sides, to see your side, to know your experience, and to get your feedback and your understanding of what the solutions are, not just what the issues are, but what the solutions are. So thank you so much for helping me and helping us to come to the table and reason together. That's where it starts. So, and it continues to be our mission to educate on what drives racism against African Americans. So, and I also want to thank you, our community, for your continued support. So thank you for always coming and supporting us and following us and learning what we can do together, because we do have common bonds. That's our name. We have a common bond to come together and figure this thing out together. So thank you, everyone. Again, we believe that maybe this is a good time to break, because as far as speaker series until maybe September, because of the summer months and people going on vacations, but we will continue to have things. So please continue to look out for the newsletter, continue to follow us, like us, our social media outlets, our platforms, because there are going to be other things. We're going to do other things in lieu of speaker series. So please continue to look out for us. We still have a work to do, and we definitely need you. We can't do it without you. So look out for opportunities for you to get involved, for you to help us. And those are some of the ways that you can do it. So with that, we are going to say goodnight. And we again thank you for your support. And we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Have a great evening and a wonderful and safe summer.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Good night.